What's up, everybody? Sean Michael Afable here. I am starting a new series, and it's called Dear Sean. See, for over a decade now, I've been helping out different youth groups, and a lot of times we get a bunch of questions and extra questions, and we don't get time to answer them during the sessions. So I decided that I'm going to actually answer them right here on YouTube. And the question I'm going to be answering today is, how do you stay close to God throughout your life? Well, I've written down 7 do's and 7 don'ts to answer this question. So without further ado, here's how to stay close to God. All right, let's jump into it. Number 1, first do is you got to prioritize. A lot of people ask, how do you find time for God? And the answer to it is pretty simple. You don't. You can't find time. There's always going to be something that's going to fill up your time. So the truth is that you really have to make time. If you don't make time, it's going to fall through the cracks and other things are going to distract you and pull you away. You really have to prioritize it. The greatest commandment in Scripture, according to Christ, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, body, and strength. And so if that's the greatest commandment, to love God, well, you really have to prioritize Him. You have to make time. Now, jumping quickly to number 2, our second do is cultivate the relationship. Now, that may sound funny, like cultivate the relationship with God? Yes, absolutely. And what does that mean? It means you have to get to know them. Any relationship, whether it's friendship or marriage or anything like that, it starts with getting to know the person. And, that's why it goes back to the first one, which is prioritizing. You have to make time because the only way to get to know somebody is if you spend time with them. Jesus says this in John 17 when he's praying to his Father. He says, "This is life eternal, that they may know thee, the one true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent." That's life eternal. That's what life is about. The meaning of life is not a bunch of doing things, but it's really to know God. When people really care about each other, it's not so much all the things that they do for you, but it's really about just being there with and for them. If you look at people on their deathbed, for instance, we often ask a strange question, is there anything I can do for you? And really at that moment, the truth is that we are already doing it. You're already doing it. You're being there. Your presence. What we really want in life is not just a bunch of things, but we want to be connected, truly connected. Mother Teresa said that the greatest poverty in life is not the lack of food, it's not the lack of water, it's loneliness. And if you would imagine yourself on a deserted island, but it had everything you wanted. It had water slides, it had, whatever theme park you can think of, all the amenities, even the best food, anything you could possibly think of. But you were the only person there. Would you want to stay? Some people are like, yeah, totally. I think you're deceiving yourself. I think you're not really thinking it through. Because we were made for relationships. Why? Because we are made in the image of God. And God is a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And He's always existed that way. And that's why we are drawn also to other people. And it's why we're ultimately drawn to God. And that's why we were made for God. St. Augustine said this. He said that, "For thou, O Lord, hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Well, what doesn't make our heart restless? A true relationship, really meaningful, deep connections, most especially with God. So you really have to cultivate that relationship with God. All right, and number 3 of our do's, and you might have guessed it, it's prayer. What does prayer mean? It simply means talking with God. Now, what kind of prayer though? Well, there's a lot of different types of prayer and different methods and whatnot. There really isn't one specific way. I will say this though, there is one really important thing to remember. Prayer is a conversation. So I learned this one thing from Peter Kreeft, that when you are talking with a baby, who's doing most of the talking? You're doing all the talking. Why? Because the baby can't talk. If you're talking with a child, who's doing the most of the talking? Well, you are, because you have more words, you can say more things, you can explain things, you're going to be talking the most. If you're talking to an equal, most likely you'll be talking an equal amount of time. If you're talking to the smartest man in the world, you'll probably be doing very little talking, and he'll probably be doing the most talking while you're listening. But if you're talking to God, well, you probably should be doing very little talking, most of the listening. So remember that during prayer, regardless of the method that you use, it's really important to listen. That's the most important thing. Because what I say may or may not be great. What you say to God may or may not be great. But what God says to us is perfect. And how do you know it's God's word? How do you know it's really God speaking to you? Well, a friend of mine told me once that God has a specific sort of voice. And I said, what do you mean? How does it sound? And he said, well, it will always sound like truth and love, because God will never lie. He will always tell us the truth, and it's always going to be love, because God himself is love. So that's number 3, prayer. Let's move on to number 4. All right, number 4 of how to stay close to God is reading the Bible and good books. Now, why is this important? Well, because the Bible is not just a history. It is a history of our faith, but it is really at the heart of it a love letter to us from God. And it's very important, I think, to start with the New Testament, especially to start with the Gospels. The first 4 books of the New Testament. That's where you hear the words of Christ himself. And I think that's a great place to start to really get the picture of who Christ was when he walked among us. But also remembering that there are really good books out there that will help you go deeper into the meaning behind Scripture. So yeah, read the Bible and good books. And some of my favorite books are C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's a great philosophical overview of our Christian faith. Peter Kreeft's Jesus Shock. It's really short, but it's really powerful. It just really digs into the heart of our Christian faith. Another one is Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love by Dr. Edward Sri. It takes the writings of St. Pope John Paul the Great's love and responsibility, and it makes it easy and digestible to figure out, what is relationships all about. The reason why we're drawn so heavily towards relationships is because God has instilled it within us. We're made in the image of God. And like I said in the first one, we're made for relationships. And in this culture especially, relationships have gotten so murky and confusing, and it really paints out what we should be looking for in ourselves, to become and how to live, and also what you should be looking for in other people, and what a relationship is really all about. And it's based, like I said, based on the writings of St. Pope John Paul the Great's Love and Responsibility. It's fantastic. I think everybody should read that, especially if you are feeling called to marriage. Another one of my favorite books is Wild at Heart. I'm actually currently rereading it for the 3rd time, and it's by John Eldredge, and it's a fantastic book. It really digs into the heart of a man and what he longs for, what he desires, what he's about, and it really changed my life when I was a young adult. And I really think, even though it was meant mostly for men, I think it's so helpful. And I've seen it help so many women to really figure out what it is they desire, what it is going on in their heart. And it really kind of flushes out what's going on in our society and why we've really become kind of broken and lost our identity as men and as women. And it helps us get back to what we were really made for. Fantastic book, Wild at Heart. And lastly, I recommend picking up a book or some reading material on apologetics. What is apologetics? It means defense. You got to pick up something to defend your faith. The reason why apologetics is important to staying close to God is that if you're struggling with whether or not you even believe God exists, well, then maybe you should pick up a book like, Trent Horn's Answering Atheism. Or if you're not sure how to defend, the Christian or Catholic faith, then you can pick up a book by Peter Kreeft, like this, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. There's a lot of materials out there, and there's a lot of great YouTube videos out there defending the faith. Maybe I'll make one soon. Okay, number 5 of how you stay close to God, and that is get back to nature. Now, this one might seem confusing. Like, what does that have to do with it? Go out and camp, and then all of a sudden God will be there? Well, maybe, but what I like about it is that it kind of gets you away from the whole 9-to-5 sort of thing that we live every single day. Our routine, a lot of times we're enclosed in cities, and we are kind of disconnected from the nature that God had originally created. And there's a great verse in the Psalms that says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." Now, when you look up at the stars, if you're living in a city, a lot of times, there's so many lights and there's actual light pollution, you can't see the stars. And there's even pollution, even worse. And so you really can't see them in their full glory. Just recently I went out to Joshua Tree and it was a super clear night and there was no clouds and the stars were just unbelievable. I could literally see like the Milky Way. It really is a breath of fresh air to go out there. You're among nature, you're among, God's creation and just the earth, and you get to see the stars. There's something about it that it's really hard to explain. When you're out there, you can kind of meditate. You can meditate on realizing that there's something beyond just all the sort of mundane things that we do in our everyday life. There's something about it that reminds us that we're more than just our jobs and our duties, but, we're in this amazing creation. We're in this amazing and beautiful world, and there's stars and galaxies even further beyond. And that for me is really helpful to kind of reset, realign, refresh, and remember God. All right, and number 6 is find good friends. Find good, godly friends. Now, this one I think is pretty straightforward. If you want to grow closer to God, if you want to grow in your faith, you have to find good, godly friends. There's an old quote that is, show me your friends and I'll show you who you are. Or there's another one that goes, you are the sum average of the 5 closest people to you. Proverbs 27:17 says, iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. If you have good, godly friends in your life, they're going to encourage you to also live that way. And so it's important to find those people who can really encourage you in the tough times, give you good advice, and maybe you can do the same for them. When you have 2 people that are working towards the same thing, it's so much easier to do. It's so much easier to live that life when you have good, godly friends around you. Honestly, I don't know what I would do without my friends who are around me, because they keep me on track, they encourage me, and I try to do the same for them. And it's like 2 coals, One coal is going to quickly, get cold because of the elements around it. But if you take 2 coals, 2 hot coals, and you put them next to each other, they'll stay hot. And so the same thing goes for your friends. If you are close with, people who are on fire for God and who are on the same mind as you, you're going to help each other grow. You're going to help each other stay on track and to stay hot like those 2 coals. All right, and number 7 of how to stay close to God is find a mentor. Now, it's so important to find other people who know more than you. We may not always be able to find the best person in our immediate circle, or it may be difficult or maybe take a lot of time to find somebody who can really mentor you. But in the meantime, one of the things that's helped me a lot is that there are plenty of mentors in the past. C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien or G.K. Chesterton or some of the great saints, Archbishop Fulton Sheen. There's some amazing, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine. I could go on and on. There are plenty of great saints, great writers, great men and women who have set the example and have passed down their knowledge into their writings, their books. If you can't find a physical mentor, I highly recommend, jumping into the great books. Like we said before, find good books to read, because they can become like your spiritual mentor in that sense of their words, their wisdom, their life, and their passion for God, jumping off those pages and making an impact in your life. Okay, we finished the 7 do's. Let's jump to the things that we should avoid. All right, the first and most obvious thing to avoid in order to stay close to God is sin. Yeah, obviously sin. Why? Well, for multiple reasons. Number 1, if you're sinning, what does sin mean? It really means separation from God. It comes from, I think, an old German word which means like sunder. It means to break apart or to rip. And sin really separates us from God. So you can't stay close to God if you're sinning, because sin means to break away, to separate. But what is sin exactly? Well, it's a lack of charity. In some way, sin lacks love for God, for others, even yourself. So sin is the opposite of God, who is himself love. God is love, and so when we do something that lacks that charitable aspect, that lacks whether we can even care about ourselves, and even in caring about ourselves, by the way, like if you brush your teeth, it's good for you, but it's also good so that you don't offend people with your bad breath. So sin isn't just something that God says, oh, you shouldn't do that. No, sin is at its core something that actually hurts ourselves and others. And yes, your relationship with God. We all heard that statement, original sin. It's a thing that kind of goes through our life and corrupts everything. If you look at all the problems in this world, it really comes down to that. It's really a warping of what love really looks like. If you really want to look at something and see why there is brokenness in this world, it really comes down to that sin. It corrupts everything. And what is sin? It's a lack of love. It's a lack of charity in some way, whether it's towards someone else or towards yourself or towards God. Christ says in his Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Well, if we want to be close to God, if we want to even see God, then we have to become pure in heart. And so sin has to really take a hike in that sense. We have to root it out of our lives, avoid it like the plague, because this really is separation from God. It harms others and ultimately harms ourselves. All right, and the second thing to avoid in order to stay close to God is distractions. You gotta avoid distractions. And there's so many distractions in our life. I think the number one distraction is our social media. It is so consuming. Just recently, I deleted off my Instagram and my Facebook, and I'm only gonna check it, every once in a while, and respond that way. But it's so important to be not distracted by all that. There's so much going on in politics and the world. If you really want to be close to God, you have to cut some of that out. Really in life, if you want to get anything done, if you want to, really live a full, fulfilled life, that stuff has to take a back seat, but especially when it comes to being close to God, because it's just so consuming. They literally designed social media to be addictive. They have psychologists who actually help design it or give instructions to make it more addictive to the user. That's what these social media apps and platforms do. They want to consume your time. They want you to be consumed by their app so that they make money. But really, as we know, the people who are on social media are very, very unhappy, when they spend so much time on it. They've actually done studies to show that the more people use social media, the more unhappy they become. If you're consumed by that, you're really not going to be able to find, or I should say, make time for God, to be closer to him. You're going to be distracted by social media or whatever it is that you're distracted in life. You got to cut out the distractions, whether that's social media or, bad habits, or maybe too much television, too much, media in general, just consuming. A lot of those things are the distractions that are really keeping us from growing deeper and cultivating our relationship with God. The third thing to avoid is bad influences. Just like we talked about having good influences, make sure you find really good people who are on the same path as you. It's just as important to avoid bad influences. There's an old saying that one bad apple can corrupt a whole bunch. Now, it's okay to be friends in one direction, helping other people find a good way to live, but remember that you have to have the correct balance, which is that you should be influencing them and not the other way around. So you really have to keep your guard up and remember to have that balance of knowing that you are a friend to them, you're being a friend to them, but they're not the ones who are influencing you. So you should be inviting them into, maybe inviting them to good discussions and good activities, but at the same time, don't be pulled into their world, their activities and things they're doing. Either find a neutral place to be a good influence and talk with them and evangelize them. But at the same time, you have to have the balance of having the good friends and realizing that although you're a friend to them, you're, trying to influence them for good, they should not have a control or an influence on you. Remembering that all it takes is one person to pull somebody underwater. If you're swimming and there's somebody who is drowning, one person can pull you down really, really quickly. And so the same thing goes with bad influences in that sense. You can try to help them, but at the same time, it's got to be on the right terms in the right places, and it can't be more often than the good friends that you spend with. You don't want to be in a situation where their tendencies and their activities and their thoughts are going to pull you in a direction that you don't want to go. All right, and the fourth thing to avoid in order to stay close to God is avoid unhealthy or bad relationships. Now, it's very easy, especially in this day, to find and meet people through different apps and whatnot, but they're not always the quality that we should be looking for. Relationships are very complicated and they're very tough, and marriage is very hard. But if you get into a bad relationship, it's going to have that much more of an effect on you. We just talked about bad influences and bad friends, even more so when it comes to romantic relationships, because you can become very attached. And so that's another topic too, how to really assess whether or not they have sufficient virtues and the same values. That all has to come up front. A lot of people are just kind of looking for somebody these days or something to kind of fill that hole, but really you got to avoid it. You got to avoid those bad relationships, unhealthy relationships where you don't have the same mindset, you don't have the same goals, you're not on the same path. And so it's going to be the same thing as that bad friend who's going to pull you into a direction that you don't want to go. So it's really important to avoid those bad, unhealthy relationships because they will have an effect on you. All right, and number 5 of what to avoid in order to stay close to God is never, 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 never give up. Never give up. In a relationship with God, there's so much pull against us. There's so many different things, whether it's sin or bad influences or distractions. There's so many different things that we just talked about. And all those things can pull us away, whether it's, not finding time or not making time or, being so caught up into our lives that it can kind of feel overwhelming. But really remember not to give up. Remember the key tips that we've talked about here, and don't give up, because something that's important as this, being close to God, you can't stop. You just got to keep going through it. And I think a lot of relationships even today, if you look at that, we often find that, the emotions aren't there. We're not motivated by that to stay in them, even if it's like, a friendship or a relationship or marriage. But the most important thing is to keep going, regardless of how you feel. I've often heard from youth that, they just stopped going to church, or they didn't want to go to church. And I'd ask them why, and they would say, well, I used to feel God, but I just don't feel him anymore. Remember that God is not a feeling. God is truth. God is love. And love is not a feeling. Catechism 1766 says, love is to will the good of another. It's a choice. And the same thing goes for your relationship with God and being close to God. Yeah, you can't give up. It's not about the feelings. It's not about the high you get when you're close to him. And yeah, of course, it's great when you're learning about him, and it's great when you're close to him. You might get those emotions that follow, but emotions are purely secondary. The primary thing is your devotion, and whether you feel it or not, or whether you want to or not, don't give up. You cannot give up on it. It is a daily choice to go after him, to know more about God, and to seek after him. So don't give up. Keep going. And eventually, when you put your time and your effort into that relationship with God, it will grow. And the emotions will probably follow, most likely. Sometimes they don't. But even if they don't, there is a peace that comes with knowing God. Remember the quote from St. Augustine earlier, "For thou, O Lord, hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Whenever we put our time, our effort into something, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so maybe you won't have those flood of emotions, but you will find something that you can't find anywhere else, and that is the peace that only God can give us. Okay, so let's recap this. The 7 do's of how to stay close to God, and the 5 don'ts, or the 5 things to avoid in order to stay close to God. Number 1 of the do's is prioritize. Make God a priority. Number 2 is cultivate the relationship, okay? Number 3 of the do's in order to stay close to God is prayer. Number 4 is read your Bible and good godly books. Number 5 is get back into nature, get away from your 9 to 5, go reset out there away from all the things that you do every single day. Number 6 is find good godly friends. And number 7 is find a mentor. Okay, and so the 5 don'ts, or the things to avoid in order to stay close to God, are avoid sin, avoid distractions, avoid bad influence or bad friends, avoid bad unhealthy relationships, and never give up. There you have it. Those are the 7 do's in order to stay close to God, and the 5 don'ts, or the 5 things to avoid in order to stay close to God throughout your life. All right, guys, I hope you like this. If you like this, please hit like. If you have a question or a comment, leave it in the comment section below. And I would really appreciate it if you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have a question that you would want me to answer, go ahead and leave it in the comment section below, and maybe I'll make a video on it. Thanks so much for watching. It's been a pleasure. Again, I'm Sean Michael Afable, and I'll see you in the next one.